Sorry, guys. I had to use that intro tonight, just because our special guest is very very swole. Uh, Welcome everyone to my channel. I'm Kipp Davis. I'm a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm joined by a lovely collection of people. My over here, yeah, there we go. My good friend Vishanti, who helps me produce. My colleague and my buddy, Dr. Josh.
I feel like tonight's video is not going to be unlike something.
The show today is no exception to some of the great work that I've done in the past.
You'll have to forgive us, Mark. We're a little silly. All of a sudden, he's like, "Oh my God, what have I gotten myself into?"
Oh no, I would feel that way if you weren't silly. So this is fine.
All right, good. And I'm very excited to introduce our special guest this evening, Dr. Mark Leuchter, professor of Jewish studies at Temple University. Did I get that right?
You got it right. Yeah.
Awesome. Yes. I'm just going to read a little bit here. His work includes the study of mythology in ancient Israel and Second Temple Judaism, the phenomenon of prophecy in the ancient Near East, the formation of the Hebrew Bible, and the history of the Israelite priesthood. And Mark is most welcome on this channel as a fellow Canadian. So
thank you.
Welcome, Mark.
And a fellow
Good
Jew.
to be here.
And a
tribe.
And a fellow Jew. There we go. Awesome. Yep. So how is everyone this evening? We're doing good. Josh has successfully recovered from COVID.
That's true.
The 5 o'clock shadow is gone.
It's gone. That's right.
So yes. Yeah. So why are we here?
Because we make gross errors. Is that what it was? I don't think that's
grotesquely
incompetence. That's right. Grotesque incompetence.
Grotesque
yes.
incompetence. Yes. So for those who may be unaware, we caught the attention of a Christian apologist here on YouTube, Inspiring Philosophy, and a certain Egyptologist from out here on the West Coast, because of a video that Josh and I made a couple months ago that was really fun, I thought, all about how scholars think through questions about the Canaanite conquest. So, in the response that Michael and his guest offered, it was long, and it was the rank errands. No, Simone, that was a different response to a different video. I'm juggling it on all sides here. I've got the Christian apologists calling me grossly incompetent, and then the Jesus mythicists telling me that that it's errant rank nonsense. But anyways, I digress. This is a topic. I think that it gets a lot of attention in these public spaces for a variety of reasons. The story of the conquest in the book of Joshua is I mean, if it's a fictional story, it can be a pretty exciting story. If it's grounded in some form of reality, it's a pretty horrifying story. It captures the imagination because it describes a lot of the a lot of places in the Levant. It reflects, or seems to reflect geopolitical situations in and around the end of the Bronze Age. So it attracts a lot of attention. It's probably the Book of Joshua. It might be fair to say that we have the Book of Joshua to thank for the emergence of biblical archaeology. Even I think it feels like when W.F. Albright started digging in Israel and Palestine, that this was one of his early points of focus, was digging up these places reported in the Book of Joshua, these sites of the Canaanite conquest. So I guess it's, on the one hand, it's unsurprising that it attracts so much attention, and I think it's also contentious for this reason. For many Christians, many Christian apologists, there's a need for these texts to ring true. There's a need for these texts to reflect things that actually happened, and that's where I think we enter the picture as scholars, as people who are trying to bring to light biblical scholarship for the wider public, and to draw public attention to the work that scholars do. These questions about the conquest, they loom large. So, sorry, I just kind of rambled on there for a little while, but that's sort of what we're doing here. I don't know. Josh, do you have anything to add to that, or
I think, for me in particular, one of the things in this type of a discussion, thanks for that, that I really, what I really think is important is, I don't have a specialization in a topic like this, right? So I'm an Assyriologist with a minor in Hebrew Bible. I've got lots of Hebrew Bible, but this sort of thing, I think it would be irresponsible to sort of just take this on myself. And so what Kipp and I try to do is go to people in the field who have done work on the topic, who have specializations that we don't have, and get their opinions. That's what we're doing here tonight. Is Mark is somebody that obviously is very well respected and published in the field. He's got an amazing 2021 edited volume on scribes and scribalism.
Yeah,
that is a meaty work. It's one of those things that I'm reading back through it and having to do it half a page at a time. So yeah, it's but that's part of, I think, what responsible scholarship online looks like. Is if we're presenting what the mainstream positions are on things, that's fine. That's great. But it's really good when things get contentious like this to bring in people that have these types of specializations. So anyway, thank you very much, Mark, for coming around and doing this.
I wasn't doing anything else tonight, so it's really okay. I was just going to be me alone in my apartment making low carb ice cream, and that can wait until later.
Low carb ice cream. Wow.
I am not surprised. Mr. makes his own ice cream. Just flexing on him. Look at
that. Josh just reminded me. You also were one of the editors of there it is, of this book that I quite enjoyed on Levites and priests in biblical history and tradition. But I think so. This is really the first of a series of video conversations that Josh and I have planned over the next, I don't know, it's going to take a while. It's probably going to be a few months on these important questions about the conquest, and the conquest narratives. And I think that's really one of the reasons why we were very interested to talk to you, Mark, just because of a lot of your work on scribalism, on the literature of the Hebrew Bible, how to correctly and properly process and understand this stuff, and to set this stuff contextually and socially, and to I feel like so often when it comes to the text, and when it comes to dealing with apologetic approaches to the text, it's just so critical. It's so important for us to refocus on the value of these texts as literature, and to understand where they came from, and what they're doing.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's also important. I really want to state this up front. Like, I don't have a problem with people who fine. And I know a lot of very smart people who do very good, smart, informed, responsible, and theologically rich apologetics. But scholarship that is not informed by a confessional interest, it plays by just a different set of rules. It's like they're both sports because they're dealing with an athletic enterprise, but one plays in a, on a field, and the other might play in a different kind of in a stadium. Different sports have different rules, and you expect different things out of these games. And so I think we can think about apologetic readings of the Bible that can be very insightful, literarily insightful, and historically insightful too. Um, and that's a different project than strictly critical readings of the Bible. And there's points of context sometimes, but they don't have to be the same thing, and they can coexist. The problem that I have is when people think it's got to be one or the other, and there's only room for any one person to abide by one, and they have to reject the other. I mean, I tend to not be that theological of a guy. I don't know a lot about theology, but I respect the people who do, and I recognize that they're doing something that it doesn't relate to what I do. And it's okay with me that they're doing it, as long as they tell me that what I'm doing isn't stupid just because it goes in a different direction. We can have respectful differences of opinion on particulars if we also recognize that the end goal of these enterprises don't wind up in the same place. They have different goals, they have different priorities, and the people who abide by them have different needs as well. And I'm fine with that. I would like for everybody to be fine with that, but sometimes it's a little bumpy.
Yeah, no, well said. I totally appreciate that. So I think maybe we just we just get right into this, into what we're gonna do here. So Josh and I have selected a series of clips from this stream that Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy did with David A. Falk, and thought we would talk through with a special focus tonight, just on some of the really the methodological issues in their approach to the text, and to the questions as they come to bear on the history, the religion, the literature, all of it. So Mark, if there's anywhere where you wanna stop and say something, please just let us know. Are you free to answer some audience questions if they come up?
Sure, I'd love to.
Yeah, so we've got all about 100 people watching right now, guys. If you have questions, the easiest way for us to see those are to super chat them. But Vishanti's gonna keep an eye on the chat, and just flag anything that looks interesting, and that you want to ask. So I think let's just start with this first clip, and I'll just set this up here. So we're going to start with uh, little bit of inception here with Michael and David watching Josh and me watching Michael and his friend Gavin Ortland, and Michael's going to talk first here about the state of scholarship, the state of the field when it comes to questions about the historicity of the Exodus and the Conquest, and I think in maybe even in larger terms the historicity of the Bible. So, are we all ready?
Yep.
Okay, let's go.
Give a summary of the scholarship on this in terms of, did the conquest of Canaan actually happen? What is the overall state of scholarship on a question like that?
Well, it seems to be shifting more in the direction of historicity. It definitely seems to be moving away from the old Deaver or Finkelstein idea that this was all mythology written later. Now, that still seems to be the consensus, especially among critical scholars for sure. But the evidence overwhelmingly supports an historical conquest. A lot of what you're going to hear is that, well, there was no evidence of widespread mass destruction throughout Canaan.
I'm actually not sure what he means by this. Like, on the one hand, he says that it is shifting more in the direction of historicity. On the other hand, that still seems to be the consensus. Who are the scholars in this small minority that are shifting toward historicity, whatever that means? Perhaps it would be useful to quote.
Well, Dr. Falk, you've talked about that over the past couple of years. What do you have to say on that comment?
Well, I mean, you do have conservative scholars that have sort of pushed back against this. You also have maximalist scholars, and they're not the same necessarily as conservatives. There are people who are coming into the field now that are more maximalist in sort of terms of their approach to the ancient texts. Okay. You also have a cadre of Egyptologists, and Moore talks about this in her book, where you've got this group of Egyptologists that are looking at the data from a different vantage point, from a different theoretical framework, and basically saying, yeah, there might be something to this whole Exodus and Conquest thing.
All right, let's pause it there. Any preliminary thoughts there from either of you?
Josh, you want to go first?
Oh, no, please.
Okay.
I'm on the edge of my seat, actually.
Okay.
Interested in what you have to say.
All right. Well, you're right. There's an inception kind of thing, like layers within layers within layers, and I had to decode that a little bit. And my autism kicked in and sort of guided me through that, which was just Smurfy. So
excellent.
I think I got it. So I want to pick up on something that Dr. Falk said. Now, I don't want to dispute somebody's credentials as an Egyptologist. I mean, I'm not an Egyptologist, and I'll always defer to what Egyptologists have to say about Egypt and about the political interactions with neighboring nations that were subordinate to Egyptian hegemony. I think that that's fair. But I think one thing that we have to bear in mind is that Egyptologists are not trained in the critical approach to biblical text. Most Egyptologists don't study the sort of things that people in my area study, just like we don't study the sort of things that they do. So I think that I think it's important to recognize that we sometimes have to defer to experts in their areas and the consensus view among those experts, even if it gives us, a bitter pill to swallow sometimes in terms of what we really want the evidence to tell us. So, I guess the best example of this, I was talking about this the other day with somebody, that having expertise in one field can give you tools to approach another field, but you have to use those tools very cautiously, because if you're not an expert in using those tools, you might make a terrible mistake, or you might make lesser mistakes, but a bunch of lesser mistakes can lead to, in abundance that clouds the issue and gets in the way rather than clarifying things. So what I suggested was that if I studied Italian medieval history, then I might be an expert in the history of medieval Italy, but that doesn't mean I'm entitled to teach Shakespeare's plays that take place in medieval Italy. Same thing with Rome, and same thing with Scotland. I mean, if I'm an expert in Scottish history, it doesn't mean that I'm really equipped to teach Macbeth. I just don't have the tools. I can bring a perspective to it that might contribute to the conversation, and I think that that's useful. And I never bat that stuff aside, because somebody will always say something that I will walk away and say, oh, I haven't thought about before. I need to give that some thought, and I think that that's fair. But I also don't want to make assumptions that because I'm seeing something different, it somehow like blows away the establishment, and we have to pick up the pieces and start over again, since now the paradigm has completely shifted. I just don't think that scholarship quite works like that.
Yeah, no, that's good. Did you have something, Josh?
Well, I kind of wanted to, and I think that's phenomenal, honestly, because this is something that Kipp and I try to say, and I think you articulated it a little bit differently than we normally do, which was fantastic. I'm an Assyriologist, right? So it's I think I have quite a bit to say about excuse me, mythological interactions, but that's very different from having an expertise in the formation of the Pentateuch, right? Or something to that effect. So this is why, if you're going to speak on the consensus, you're going to do the research, use those tools to do responsible research into a consensus or a mainstream position, and present that tentatively, deferring obviously to those people that are experts, like the Joel Badens and the Conrad Schmitz and all that stuff. That's great. But me coming in and saying, oh well, here, I've reread Genesis 37, I know Hebrew. I disagree with Joel Baden's position on this, and here's how I blow his position out of the water. Like, it's a little bit of hubris mixed in there that I probably shouldn't have. But I wanted to ask, and you have all these questions, so not catching anything off guard. What are your thoughts on his assessment of the state of the field when it comes to something like the historicity of, here we're specifically talking about the conquest, but he brought in the Exodus. Like, what are your thoughts on that, sort of the way that he responded to that?
Well, my experience has been a little bit different. I have encountered scholars who do think that there was an Exodus event, and there was and of course that was a very common way of viewing the material and viewing the text from a historical perspective, for a long time in scholarship. In my experience, the scholars that I mostly interact with, and a lot of whom I may disagree with on various points, it seems to be a little bit more varied. So my perspective, for example, on the Exodus, my last book on the Levites, the first 2 chapters were really on the Exodus tradition and the origins of the Exodus tradition. I've encountered a lot of people in my field who just think the Exodus is fictional, that there was no historical Moses, and that there was no break with Egypt, and this is all, it's like late myth making. And I mean, I have a problem with that, because I don't think the evidence actually supports that. But at the same time, we don't have to go, it's not binary, it's not like all or nothing. If the evidence doesn't support people who argue that the Exodus was a completely mythological construct, it also doesn't quite support, at least from what we can tell, a single Exodus moment, or a single Exodus span of years, a year-long Exodus or something, or even a week-long Exodus, as the narrative seems to suggest. It's a more truncated period of time. The evidence doesn't suggest that either. I think a responsible reading, a critically responsible reading, is to say, well, we have this story that embeds memories of real events, but the way that we make memories make sense to us is that we orchestrate them into a thematic construct that highlights the important lessons that we learn from the past that we experienced. And anybody who's done study on human memory, this is actually how we make memories in our own lives. Let me share just one example. And this is from a colleague that I used to work with, who's no longer at my institution, but we used to go to the gym together. And I remember we were doing pull-ups one day. And as I'm doing my pull-ups, he very honestly and very seriously said, Captain Crunch's full name is Horatio Magellan Crunch. And, I had to stop doing pull-ups because I just started laughing. Of course, this is what serious biblical scholars talk about, like, breakfast cereal. And
you had to stop
at
37.
What'd you say?
Yeah,
that's what it was. You had to stop at 37 pull-ups. Unfortunately, I got you. Go ahead.
No,
Sorry.
you only do 10, but you do them real slow on the way down. That's where you get the
Oh,
strength
okay.
gains. So
All right.
yeah. So I had to stop and I said, "Oh, come on, don't be ridiculous," or something like that. And he goes, "No, I've known this my whole life." And so I'm like, "Well, let's see about that." And we went back to my office and we Googled it. And in fact, if you were to Google it right now, Captain Crunch's full name is indeed Horatio Magellan Crunch. However, that name didn't exist before an ad campaign sometime around 2004. So my colleague could not have known this when he was a child because that name didn't exist when he was a child. But in his memory, he associated something he learned in 2004 with a formative period in his childhood when Captain Crunch meant a lot more to him, I guess, than it did as an adult. So human memories tend to telescope events into thematically significant constructs. And that's how we access these memories, and that's how we experience or re-experience these things. And I think that cultures do the same thing. So when we talk about something like the Exodus or the Conquest, I don't think we're talking about something that's disconnected from history. I really think there's good historical information there that we can carefully mine to get a sense of the past that's being remembered. But I think we need to keep in mind that it is a past being remembered. It's being remembered on a literary level, and it's being remembered on a cultural level. And I think if we bear that in mind, we can bring that sort of anthropological approach and that literary approach to decoding the symbolic richness of the text. I think just, trying to flatten it into it happened or it didn't happen ignores some of the real depth of the text that thinkers have been wrestling with for 2,000 years. And that's where you find the real meaningful stuff.
Can you say something a little bit more about that maybe at this point? Like, what are these texts? Like, how should we be reading these texts? Where did they come from? What are they doing? Even if they're reflecting echoes or memories from the distant past, how should we be approaching the text?
Well,
Like
it depends on the we. Like you and me and Josh, we would approach it, in a very particular way for probably the same kind of purposes, because most of the reasons why we engage these texts is for academic purposes. If you're talking about reading these texts as a Jew or as a Christian for confessional purposes, then we have to approach it very differently. One of the things that I've really liked and learned from my colleagues who are confessionally identifying Christians is how to read these texts as Christians, and I think that that's completely fair. So Mark Boda, who's a scholar in Canada, some of you probably know him. He wrote a really magnificent commentary on the book of Zechariah, and the commentary is very critically sound. But then, usually at the end of each commentary section, there's a discussion on what this means if you're reading it as Christian scripture. And when I was doing my own training, I mean, I'm Jewish, but on one hand, my thesis director was Brian Peckham, who was a Jesuit priest. And on the other hand, my secondary thesis director was Jerry Shepard, who was a Methodist minister. I was very much made aware of the fact that you can read these things for historical critical purposes, and reading them as a Christian entails a very, very different approach and a different set of priorities. And so when you say, how should we read them? It's really a question of, well, who are you as you're reading it? If you're giving a sermon or if you're leading a church study group, then you put on a different hat. If you're at the Society of Biblical Literature annual meeting, or if you're at any kind of conference where it's primarily geared towards historical critical research or literary critical research or whatever, then you might want to put on a different hat for that. So the hats that I wear, they all tend to be variations of each other, and that's going to be different than what a very intelligent and learned, academically learned rabbi might do in speaking about this stuff to his or her congregation, and it will be very different than what a very learned and academically accomplished minister or pastor might do when dealing with his or her congregation. So it really depends on the hat that you're wearing and the way that you're identifying as you're reading it.
Could I give an analogy and see if how you think it holds or doesn't hold? I really like the song "King of Wishful Thinking." Nobody should, be upset with me in the chat, although I'm sure I will get some pushback on that, probably from you two as well, actually, as hardcore as you both are. But I really enjoy it. Interestingly enough, when I listen to it, it makes me feel very differently from what the lyrics actually say, right? And probably, I've never done the research, but probably what the band the writers intended when they wrote it. So there are two different ways you could approach, at least two different ways that you could approach that song. You could approach it from more of a reader response, type of interpretive framework, and say, how does this speak to me? What does this song say to me? And that's a perfectly legitimate way to approach the song. There's also a, what did the writer mean in his time when he wrote this thing? And that's a different approach. And I think that what maybe Kipp and I experience, and I'm sure you have experienced, and we all have experienced that are in the field, is someone who is taking a, how does this make me feel? Or how does this affect my belief? Or how does this, I'm reading this from a theological lens, and sort of having that interpretive framework impose on a historical critical framework, and pushing into it in a way that doesn't allow, as you said before, both to stand on their own and not to impose upon the other. What do you think about that type of analogy? Where is it strong? Where is it weak?
I think, well, I don't have a problem with the song. First of all, you should know I'm not a death metal guy. I'm a big fan of Rush. I'm just like, and the Tragically Hip and 5440 and all these very conventional Canadian rock bands.
He's a good Canadian boy. Yeah,
I'm a pretty good Canadian boy. So I
see all the guitar pedals, and I just made the assumption. I shouldn't have made the assumption.
Listen, I make pedals for serious metalheads. But I'm not one of them.
Right after you're finished making your high protein ice cream.
Listen, you have to diversify. If it's all historical critical stuff all the time, life gets very, very boring. So yeah. I mean, really, we go out and like play frisbee or something to do something to have some fun. But I think it's a fair analogy, and I think it's a common issue. One of my challenges is that my sort of mantra as a scholar, and really just as a person, is like, what can I learn from somebody else, even somebody that I might disagree with? How can I respect what something means to them without necessarily disrespecting what it means to me? And in this way, like, I think I've been able over the years to find ways to have, some kind of dialogue with folks who do take this stuff, either literally or view it as, ethically binding. And you can still have a conversation with them as long as there's a kind of respect for where you're coming from too. Like I tell my undergraduate students all the time, look, my goal isn't to get everybody in the classroom to say, I agree with Mark on this. My goal is just to get everybody in the classroom to say, well, that's not stupid, right? If I can get somebody to disagree with me, but say, I don't agree with you, but you're not being stupid in where you're coming from, I consider that a win. I mean, that's a humane win. And the goal of any kind of dialogue should be like, how can we make this a better dialogue? How can we make what we have to say about this stuff more resonant and not just a matter of like, people on opposite Red Rover teams trying to break each other down? And I mean, I think more often than not, it's a difficult prospect and it's an idealistic idea that I've just articulated. And I have had people tell me I was going to hell. And I don't like that. I mean, I'm just doing my best, right? Like I'm just a nice Canadian boy. And so what I do students in my intro to Bible classes is I tell them, hey, look, the first couple of years that I taught this, students would get up usually by the second or third lecture and tell me I was going to hell. So can we just get that out of the way right now? And I'll have I will have 100 students on the count of 3 all say, you're going to hell. And I'm like, brilliant. Okay, good, we got that out of the way. So and let's go on. And like, I think, if you bring a little levity into it, then you can both recognize that what we're going to do might challenge some of the things that are sacred to you, but I'm not discounting those things that are sacred to you. I just want to present you with a different point of view that's not stupid. And all I'm asking is that you recognize why it's not stupid, not that you necessarily adopt it as your own. And I think there is room for that. It's just hard to do sometimes.
I'm going to say we got some super chats, or a super chat, and I will go ahead and read that, and then maybe ask a couple questions of the panel to kind of direct the conversation, because this is an amazing panel. All right, for $2 from Aramgard, who has an excellent taste in music. Does Joshua have archaic poetry like Judges 5?
Oh, that's a good question. Joshua has very interesting language, and it has what strike me as some pretty old traditions in it. It even has multiple layers of text which presuppose different stages of understanding society and understanding the relationship between the people of Israel and the divine. There are like brief snippets in Joshua, but it's not anything as extensive as Judges chapter 5, which is the Song of Deborah. I love Judges chapter 5. I think it is such an important and insightful and really richly detailed glimpse into what Israel must have looked like sometime around 1150-ish BCE or very shortly thereafter. In other words, within the first century or the first couple generations of an emergent Israel actually showing up in the archaeological record in the highlands of Canaan. I don't think we have anything quite like that in Joshua, or not anything that serves at least that purpose in Joshua. But there are some like little tiny flourishes in Joshua that are very clearly dealing with traditions of extremely high antiquity. So one that I can just think of off the bat is in Joshua chapter 15, I think it's verse 9. There's a reference to something that's called the Fountain of the Waters of Nephtoah. And Gary Rensburg, in an article from several years ago, I think made an open and shut case that the original text actually read the Fountain of Merneptah. So what you have in Joshua 15, is a living tradition in the memory and the culture of the author of that text that knows about Pharaoh Merneptah from the year 1209-ish BCE, who went through the area and campaigned and wrote about his conflict with Israel, and saying in line 27 of his description, Israel has been laid waste, its seed is no more. So I mean, there's some really old stuff in Joshua. Now, just because there's old stuff doesn't mean that it's being packaged in a way that is historically transparent. And so I think that's where we have to do some of our careful mining. And really a better question is, how is the author and his audience, how are they remembering this place called the waters of Merneptah, or the Fountain of Merneptah? Clearly they must have known who Merneptah was. I mean, you don't forget a pharaoh like that, the same way you wouldn't forget a pharaoh like Ramses or a pharaoh like Akhenaten. I mean, you just don't forget these people. They last very, very long in public memory, and we can't forget how important memory is in the shaping of our perceptions and the shaping and understanding of the way we transmit those perceptions in literary form. It's all a question of memory and cognition. So if Merneptah has been like in the cultural ether for a long time, that might affect how you view other traditions that date back a couple hundred years about conflicts that early Israel might have had, or parts of early Israel might have had, with local neighbors warring with them. And so I think that it gets complicated. And I don't discount people who say, well, this is an indication of how old these traditions are, because I think that they are old. But how is the text remembering them? And more importantly, why is the text remembering them and orchestrating them in this way? Like when the archaeological record hints towards the text but doesn't align with the text, we don't have to choose one or the other. Rather, we can say, so if the archaeological record gives us a slightly different picture than what the text is giving us, what is the text trying to tell us? Like, for my friends who are Christian, who view the text as the living word of God, then that's the really central question. Like, what is the text trying to tell you about how you're supposed to remember the past, and how might that connect you with the concept of the divine? That seems to be the project that I think religious readers are doing when they're bringing an informed perspective to this text. People who are reading the text for non-religious purposes might ask a very different set of questions, and I think that that's okay too. But I do think that we have to be very nuanced and cautious about how we're mining this information, even when we're looking at a longer text like Judges chapter 5. Even that text, as long as it is, as ornate a poem as it is, I still think we have to be cautious about what we can assume when we're reading it, because we're reading something that's very, very old, and we don't live in the same world as the people who wrote it and the people who initially transmitted it and cultivated it. We're living in a very different world, and some of our assumptions and some of our understandings and cognitive processes have really changed. And to decommission the wiring that we have and rewire it so that we can see things as clearly as an ancient person might have seen when they read that chapter in Judges 5, that's an exceedingly difficult thing to do. I don't know if it's impossible, but it's really hard.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well,
thank you for the question.
Master class.
Ermgard. I know this is great, eh?
Yeah.
I feel like okay, let's
Yeah, I was
let's
gonna
read this one,
direct
and then
us
I
just
think
a
we need to
little.
move on
Right.
to
Yeah.
the next section
So
in the
this is
video.
really spinning into some of the notes that you had given. So Plant Peterson says the consensus is that it didn't happen, but the evidence overwhelmingly supports that it did happen. This the same conspiracy brain nonsense people who say evolution was made to deny Christ say, which kind of brings us around to, all right, this is getting us where we want to go. What is the actual state of scholarship in these conquest narratives and the book of Joshua, and how do we know what is going on there?
And if I could,
oh yeah, go ahead, Josh,
Mark,
please.
I just want to, because I want to set up the question exactly as I want it answered. I'm just kidding. I'm not kidding, but you know, people ask me quite frequently something like, "Did the Exodus happen, or did the conquest happen?" And my response is almost always, "Well, it depends on what you mean by Exodus and happen." Right? Because I think the answer requires that type of nuance. But in almost every case, while that is true, that we need to nuance it like that, what they're actually asking is, when I flip open the book of Joshua and I read Joshua chapter 6, and it talks about the Israelites marching around and then the walls came crumbling down, did that happen in history as the narrative portrays? So I often try to nuance it from there, but I do think that's an important question that is probably what Planet Peterson is getting at there. I could be wrong, but I suspect that's the case. So could we sort of go from that less nuanced question and then nuance it forward to the way that we should be thinking about it?
I think it's possible. Again, I think we have to be cautious. I think these texts, whether you view them as holy writ or whether you just view them as a cultural legacy, these texts are precious and they demand that we approach them cautiously and with a degree of humility too. We know a lot, and we're an intelligent collection of people. You know, we have a very good tool set, but not every tool set is always going to be able to fix or clarify some of the things that still make these texts so mysterious and full of such power, such identity forming power. So to answer the question directly is difficult for me, because I have to admit some of the ways that I've always approached this come from my own background as a Jew. So I'm not a terribly religious guy, but I was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish community, and I received a traditional Jewish education. And for Jews, none of these texts were literal. I mean, none of them. When the text says that something happens, Jews never read as that's it. Text says it, that's what happened. Jews have always read it midrashically. There's always an implied sacred meaning under the surface of the text. And so, the real theologically charged readings for Jews are always about looking at the text symbolically. And it's very difficult for me, even as an academic, to not have that sort of play in the back of my head, just because, from age 2 until I was about 13, that's the framework that wired my cognition. And it's very difficult. Any cognitive scientist will tell you it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for people to escape these neural frameworks if they're forged when you're very young. So even as a scholar, I still am always hesitant to look at a text, and a text that says XYZ, I'm always hesitant to say, well, that just tells me that XYZ happened. I'm always looking for what kind of hypertextual implications can I find. And I do think that's probably a safer way in some ways to read the book of Joshua and to read the idea of the conquest. One thing that I think is very important to bear in mind is that the language of the book of Joshua is not archaic Hebrew. It's a later form, kind of like a standard form of Hebrew that you would find, in the 7th or maybe the late 8th century BCE. It's the language of like the second half of the monarchic period. And many scholars, myself included, think that a lot of the texts in a recognizable form were forged during that time. It doesn't mean that there weren't textual antecedents. It just means that the antecedents from the 10th century or the 9th century or whatever they weren't as fleshed out as the versions of the stories that we now have in some recognizable form, a form where you would look at it and say, oh yeah, that looks very similar to the form that, you know, the King James version has rendered, you know, in Old English, or you know, an older form of English, or that the Hebrew Bible, as it's been passed along in the Jewish world, renders these stories. I mean, I think that the mature form of these stories begins sometime in the late monarchic period. And if that's the case, then if we then the text is all we have. We have to start from there, and we have to say, well, if the book of Joshua as a book, as an actual material text, you know, like written on papyrus, or written on a parchment scroll, or written on, you know, multiple pages of papyrus that weren't necessarily in any particular order and that were ordered later. If that's how the book of Joshua formed, and it formed in the late monarchic period, what did the antecedents look like, and what were the antecedents talking about? And the sad fact is that we just don't know. You know, we don't know what the original orchestration of this material looked like. A colleague of mine at Notre Dame University, Nathan Masnek, just wrote a really interesting book about prophetic scrolls, and the fact that we read prophetic books as we encounter them now, and we imagine that they were all in one big long scroll. But he sees it more as a scrapbook, you know, like almost like a shoebox full of different letters. And, you know, when you open up the shoebox, you find a letter from 1993, and then you find another one from 1988, and then you find another one from you know, 2005. He sees the prophetic text as initially like almost like a little trove, or a little collection, like an archive of independent oracle or oracular units, and only later were they strung together into something thematic. And we can imagine something like that actually happening with the Joshua traditions as well. So we're dealing with late monarchic texts that are already centuries removed from you know, an actual event. And it doesn't mean that they're not preserving some authentic memories of that actual event, but how is the sequence of that preservation orchestrated? And that's a scribal product. That's the hands of scribes who are trying to make sense of these traditions, and trying to make these traditions relevant to the audiences of their time. The second thing that I want to say, and I think this is really important, is that the book of Judges just gives us a very different perspective on what a conquest would have looked like. I mean, from my perspective, I think the book of Judges, even though it's clearly a literary construct, I mean, there's a thematic structure to the book of Judges, it gets us a little closer to what Israel's initial settlement in the highlands in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE might have actually looked like, or might have at least felt like. And it's more piecemeal. It's more ad hoc. It's not as unified. It's not as totalizing in the way that it narrates these things happening. My colleague, yeah, I'm sure you know him, Bob Cargill. One of my favorite things that he says in a video somewhere, or maybe it's an audio recording, I can't remember. He draws attention to the fact that the Lord was with Judah in all things except for the defeat of the Canaanites, because they had iron chariots. So, you know, there you have the book of Judges almost telling the audience, like, hey, take this with a grain of salt, because if the Lord is with Judah in all things, but he can't defeat chariots, how dependable is this story, you know, as a source of unassailable fact? And I mean, I think that there's a lot of literary play going on. I don't think we can dismiss the artistry and the genius, and for some people that I've worked with, including Jerry Shepard, the inspired genius of the scribes who wrote this stuff out, and who wanted us to think through the material that we were reading, who wanted to draw attention to the bumps so that we would think about why the bumps are there, as opposed to just reading something simply and smoothly. So when we think about Joshua versus Judges, we get some very big bumps there. And reading them together gives us a deeper understanding of why the audience needs these bumps. You know, a simple story is one that you can just put on a shelf and put away and say, well, I'm done reading that. A story that's not simple, a story that is sort of difficult to swallow, I mean, you got to come back to it a couple times. You have to read it. You have to commit to it. You have to think through it, and you have to think about what it means to you and what you can learn from it too.
Nice. Wow. Thanks so much for that. This is turning out to be a great conversation.
It's entertaining to watch some of the people in the chat get irritated that these aren't just simple yes/no questions. Like, if you want simple yes/no questions, this is not the side of the pool for that. You can go play in the little kiddie pool if you want to, because when you're discussing history, archaeology, things like that, they're never that simple, ever.
I agree. I do think that there are some things that I can give some simple answers to. So like at least in my opinion, which I think is like not perfect, but is not stupid again. Like I don't think I represent like a fringe perspective on this. I think we can say certain things did happen, but we can only say limited things about these things that did happen. And then we have to look at the text and say, well, what is the text telling us about this in greater detail? And what does that mean in terms of being a reader, in antiquity, or an audience member? How does it land with them? And so, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, folks in the chat, that some of this stuff gets complicated, but if it was really simple, it would also be kind of boring, wouldn't it? So why
Exactly.
shouldn't we have some fun with this stuff? And
Yeah.
it is fun too.
Yeah, that's what I find is when the text raises so many questions like this, it just makes it more interesting and more fun as a reader, as an interpreter. So maybe let's pull up the second clip, and we'll watch that and talk some more.
This is Christian Frevel in the History of Ancient Israel 2023. In any discussion of the conquest of the land, it is essential to understand the conceptual contrast between an Israel that entered the country as an ethnic entity from outside and an Israel that only gradually formed within the country and emerged therefrom as a new ethnic entity. Recent research has shown that Israel is no different from its neighbors in this respect. With the exception of the Philistines, all the subsequent peoples of Palestine, for example, Moabites and Ammonites, as well as Judeans and Israelites, are predominantly indigenous. Any migration of larger parts of the population as a background for the emergence of Israel must be ruled out.
There's this, I mean, I just saw this, just noted this right now. Frevel does take an extreme minimalist approach. On page 7, Frevel says, quote, Israel was never a real historical entity, end quote. I don't think, say, the mushy middle of scholarship would even take that anymore. I think that's an extreme view by any stretch of the imagination. But one of the things I just noticed in comment here was that when they talk about the peoples of the Levant, they're talking about Ammonites, Moabites, Canaanites. They're not talking about the Amorites. The Amorites are completely missing from that quote, and yet they are the dominant faction in Israel at the time of the conquest. The Canaanites aren't the dominant people politically in Israel at the time of the conquest. It's the Amorites. The Amorites conquer Canaan 100 years before the conquest and basically set up this large kingdom. And in fact, if you read the Amarna letters talk about how the Amorites are conquering city after city after city. And this includes basically a span of territory from Byblos all the way across to the Heshbon and down into the Judean foothills.
All right. I think first maybe I wanted to ask if you felt that the citation that Josh read from Christian Frevel's new book on Judean history was a fair appraisal of the of the current state of the field in terms of understanding who the Israelites were, where they came from. I think Dr. Falk's reaction to it was rather telling. But yeah, I don't know. What did you think about that?
I mean, I disagree with some of the contents of the excerpt that was written. I don't think it's absurd, but I do think that it again, it requires a little bit more nuance than that. So I do agree that there's a very good argument to be made that Israel as an ethnic group has a cultural patrimony with earlier indigenous groups in the area, but not exclusively to the earlier indigenous groups. I think that you have a mixture of people living in a frontier environment that are forging alliances and are forging larger sort of meta clans and meta tribes, and it ebbs and flows over time until you wind up getting a 12 tribe system, but that takes a while to get there. And I think that predominantly most Israelites in emergent Israel, what I called in my last book emergent Israel, the very earliest levels of Israel, are probably a combination of people from the lowland Canaanite city-states who were sort of disaffected with the economy and political situation of the time, and basically said, nuts to this, let's go to the hills. And they were kind of like hillbillies on one level and hippies on another. And they started a new life, and they took on a new identity. But I don't think that those are the only people that were part of those communities. I do think that you have transhuman groups that come into those communities as well, and they're not necessarily from that area. And so if anybody wants to talk more about this, feel free to email me or find me on Twitter. By the way, I saw Captain Dadpool chime in here. And Captain Dadpool, I follow you on Twitter. Give me a follow back. I mean, come on, it's been years already. And then again, I haven't really commented that much. I just benefit from your comments online. So isn't it interesting how the world gets very, very small in these conversations? So anyway, I digress. I don't think he's wrong. I don't think that Dr. Falk is wrong to question some of the conclusions that Dr. Fravel comes up with. But I also think that balking at it completely is maybe misevaluating or misjudging the range of views and the scope of perspectives that are typically brought into this conversation. There are definitely people who think that Israel as a historical entity is largely just a phantom. But I really disagree with them. I don't think we can say that. In fact, I'll mention it. The first 2 chapters of my last book explain why I think that. I just think it's unreasonable to imagine that when Merneptah talks about a people called Israel in a particular part of the world, and then about a century later, you have settlements that are very, very close to how the Bible remembers earliest Israel in the 12th century, and they call themselves Israel. And you have other groups of people and other places that look to those same communities, 2 centuries, 3 centuries later, and refer to them in terms of like, Ephraim or Beit David or Beit Humri, I guess it is. I mean, we see a continuity of community, and I think it's not unreasonable to say that, yes, there's a community of a historical Israel, and the Bible knows this, or biblical texts know this. But I think that there is also a really important nuance, and I can't remember the scholar who made this argument, but I think I agree with it, and that is that historical Israel, ancient Israel, is not the same as biblical Israel. Biblical Israel is a literary reflection of how the authors understood ancient Israel, the ancient Israel of their time and the ancient Israel of before their time. And I think that biblical Israel tells us a lot about ancient Israel, but it doesn't tell us everything. And it doesn't tell us everything about all corners of ancient Israel. So, my position isn't the same as Dr. Fravel's, but it's also not, it's not going to just like throw it to the side and say, hey, that's baloney, because I don't think it's baloney, but I do think that there are other factors that we need to work into the conversation.
I mean, I think that, so we did a separate stream over on Rationality Rules that's been pre-recorded, and we talked about this quote. My friend Heath Durrell reviewed Fravel's book, I think in July. And, I messaged Heath and I said, like, look, I think that when Fravel is talking about this, he's talking about this, he's using this term sort of in a specialized way based on this minimalist maximalist debate. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And he agreed because he says in his review that after sending out the minimalist maximalist discussion, he ends up in sort of he didn't call it the mushy middle, but like the middle in between both positions. Mm-hmm. So I think that maybe Falk misunderstood, maybe reasonably so, if you're just looking at the quote and not reading the wider context. That I think that Fravel was not saying, there is no entity called Israel in the late Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. I think what he was saying is that this, as you talk about this sort of amalgamation, this creation that we've put together as biblical Israel, was not an entity, because he goes on to say, but that doesn't mean that we just disregard the biblical text, because biblical Israel helps inform us about what not ancient Israel, but there's three of them, and I can't remember what Philip Davies, how he separated them out off the top of my
it was
head.
Davies. That's right. That's
I think
right.
so,
Yeah.
but
Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. I haven't read Froebel's book, and this is one of the sort of the curses of the field. Like, there's so much that comes out, and when you specialize in an area of particular research, like for the last couple of years, I've been working on the late Persian period because that's what my current book is about. Like, that's the only stuff I'm reading. I mean, I'm reading stuff from like the 6th century down to the 3rd century, and things related to that. And Froebel's argument is about something from centuries earlier, and it's a shame because like there's so much interesting stuff that's out that I can really learn from, and we just get siloed off into these little curves. But unfortunately, that's also how you do your work. Like if you're going to write a book like my current book, which is going to be out hopefully next month, on Jewish scribes in the late Persian period, that's what you focus on. You can't talk about it all. It's not really possible to say anything meaningful when you talk about it all. I do want to come back to something that Dr. Falk mentioned, and that was the issue of the Amorites. I don't think on one level I don't think he's wrong to talk about the prevalence of the Amorites as this group of people, in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, who are expanding out and really making a name for themselves in the ancient Near East and West Asia. And I think that that's what is remembered in the biblical texts by later authors. So I think that instead of looking at the biblical texts and saying that the biblical texts are talking about the same Amorites and the way that they were living and the distinctions between them and other peoples, I think again, like when something is in the distant past, you can remember important things from it, but you might package it in a way that makes much more sense to your current audience. The example that I give my undergraduate students about this is like, imagine somebody saying that General Patton, before he would go out to war, would load up his would load up his iPhone or his iPod with his favorite playlist, and that would inspire him, to go out to war. That might seem like, if you didn't know anything about technology, and you were like a 7 or 8 year old kid living in 2012 or whatever, because I don't think people have iPods anymore, that might make sense to you. But as somebody who knows that iPods didn't exist, in General Patton's time in the 1940s, that wouldn't make sense. So I think stuff like that is going on with the reference to the Amorites. I also think that the actual historical reach of the Amorites and the way that they made an impression in the world at that point manifests differently, and not in a way that separates them quite as distinctly from Israel. So, for example, if I'm remembering correctly, Daniel Fleming wrote a book on Emar, and there's a group of people called the Yamanites in Emar that he connects to the Benjaminites, the B'nai Yamin, right, the sons of the south, and these are a sort of Israelite offshoot, or an offshoot of the Yamanites, who become part of the Israelite tribal league, over several centuries of integration, before you get down to the monarchic period. So it's a long-term process where these Yamanites branch off from other Amorite people and become Israelite people. I mean, ethnogenesis is a complicated thing. It takes a long time for ethnicities to develop. Well, if that's the case, then a significant portion of ancient Israel, the Benjaminites, have a real cultural link to the Amorites. And the Amorites aren't quite as separate from Israel as the idea of an Israel coming in after the it's a little bit more complicated than that when we take a look at the way that these things tease out as we sort of untangle them, and we still have a lot more to learn. So we can't say anything definite, but I do think that we have to be cautious about periodizing history and saying that the Amorites were there 100 years before the conquest event, because I do think, like, we can talk about a conquest, but I think it's a long-term thing, and it didn't necessarily happen the way that the narratives in Joshua 1 through 12 suggests that they happen in a specific and truncated period of time under one leader with one unified army. I think that that's an idealized way of remembering a much more fragmented and really vicious and bloody span of centuries, as the highland frontier was becoming settled and people were fighting against each other.
Yeah, no, that's really good. So
yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Josh.
When I heard sort of this presentation of as you say, like 100 years beforehand, and you can see in the Amarna letters they're conquering. You know, the Amorites, the discussion about the Amorites, I mean, it was something that, you know, at Hopkins, we spent ungodly amounts of time talking about the Amorites of the late third millennium, right? And how, you know, the Amorites, you know, sort of took over during the first part of the second millennium, and what that meant, who are the Amorites, you know, and that it was something that ad nauseum, and something that I think I segmented a part of my brain. But, you know, I think making these sort of clear, definitive statements about this group did X here. First off, it really did, and I'd like your take on it. It sounded like what his reconstruction was sort of an amalgamation. It's apparently my favorite word tonight, of what he reads of the Amuru in the Amarna letters and what, you know, Numbers and Joshua say about the makeup of the people groups and the kings that were in the land at the time. And I don't think, to say this nice, I don't think that does justice to the debate today between like people with like Aaron Burke and, as you say, Dan Fleming, and who is it, Robert Holmshire, like these who the Amorites are. This Mary Ellen Buck has her that book on the smaller book on the Canaanites, on Ugarit, and like are they all coming from Jebel Bishri? Do we like? I don't think so, probably. But I mean, it's not my area, right? It's not my area of expertise. But the fact that there's so much debate about what it meant to be Amorite. Is there an Amorite Koine? And do we have a material culture that follows the Amorites? It just seemed very overly simplistic to say, as you said, like 100 years before, this is when this happened. They went from city to city. You can see it in the Amarna period. Like that to me doesn't do justice to the debate. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I might agree. Again, I don't want to fault somebody for making it digestible for an audience that's not in an audience that does research in this stuff. And I think that there's room for making it digestible, as long as you also say this is a very simplified, sort of quick and dirty version of my understanding of this issue, as opposed to just saying, I'm going to say it this way, this is how it was, let's move on. There's, again, it's about audience. Like if you're addressing a group of undergraduate students or graduate students who are really trying to seriously learn this stuff, you'll have to get into the weeds a little bit more. If your focus really isn't on the historical periodization of the Amorites, and it's on other things, then okay, you might get away with a sort of quick and dirty summary of it. But at least I think you should sort of tip your hat and say, like, hey, I'm just barely scratching the surface on this stuff. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. Because you're right, we aren't experts on everything. we have to contain what we say and qualify it by saying, look, my expertise is in another area, but this is how I understand it.
All right, let's do another quick, and I will hold us to that quick round of super chats. All righty. Do you think obsessing over historicity binds us to the meaningful narrative of the text, both as historians and abroad? Seems to miss their value, says Chris H for $5. Not all at once.
Is that for me?
Please, Mark.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. I think it can. I don't want to dismiss the search for history, because that's what I do, and I love it. And it's fascinating to me when I can look at something in a text and sort of get the world behind the text from it. But that's also an important distinction. There's a world behind the text and there's a world in the text. So, like, for example, I'm writing an article right now on Genesis chapter 4, the Cain and Abel, conflict and the consequences thereof. Like, that's a brilliant story, and it's deeply thematically and theologically rich. But there's also an anthropological world behind that text. and the story can give us a glimpse into that anthropological world. And that's what I'm interested in doing. So I think looking at the text as a historical resource is very, very valuable. But I do think, again, depending on why you're looking at the text, only focusing on this, it happened the way the text said, it can sometimes, maybe even often, maybe even regularly, make us miss a little nuance in the text that tells us that something else is going on. So I'll give you a really good example. I have an article coming out in an edited volume soon. With the best title I ever came up with for an article is Mel Brooks Also Among the Prophets. And it deals with the question of the people of the land. And so the people of the land is a trope that comes up in his movie Blazing Saddles, and that's why I talk about it. But I also talk about how prophetic texts use the trope people of the land. And there's all kinds of like implicit meaning in that phrase. Like in Hebrew, Am Haaretz can mean, literally it means people of the land, but it can also mean kin of the underworld. What's the relationship between these rural elites who mediated connection to the dead ancestors at the mouth of the tomb, and some of whom may be engaged in rituals of divination involving the wisdom of the ancestors or whatever. I mean, that's what Am Haaretz could also mean. And some of these prophetic texts are ridiculing that at a time when people are being uprooted from their land. So in a way, if we're only looking at it on a literal level, we miss some of the nuance that's cooked into these texts. The double entendre that always accompanies a text in its original form is oftentimes lost, not only over time, but of course in translation into another language too. But even if you're reading it in Hebrew, like my Hebrew is very good, and I grew up speaking Hebrew, but like I'm living in 2024, and Hebrew in 2024 is very, 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 very different than Hebrew in 586 BCE or 550 BCE, when a lot of the stuff was revised and redacted. I mean, I can make sense of it, but am I really getting all the nuance? And the answer is probably not. So I do think that an obsession over historicity can be problematic that way.
That's another thing that people tend to miss, is when the text is being sarcastic or it's making a tongue-in-cheek reference, you tend to miss that if you're only looking at it through the lens of, did this happen exactly as it says or not? That's not the only way you have to read it. Josh, do you have any thoughts on that particular one?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, and Kipp, I'm going to speak for you, but I think I'll be correct, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think the frustrating thing for us is that we have to do so many internal critiques, because the people that we very often engage with are holding up the text through such an interpretive lens that is very often, based on inerrancy or infallibility. It's based on, we need to build our ethical system, maybe quite specifically from the texts here in the Hebrew Bible, and I think that battle often requires us to say, okay, look, we need to be thinking about this very differently. So let me enter into your presuppositions about the text so that I can show you the inconsistencies from outside the text, from archaeology or from history or whatever. In the same way that I might go to Tukulti, the Tukulti Ninurta epic in the late second millennium and say, okay, you think that Tukulti Ninurta was perfectly justified in doing battle with Kashiliash IV, the Kassite king, and because he was totally wicked. Because look, he says in the text, Kashiliash himself says, I was really sinful and wicked. So if I enter into your presuppositions about this being divinely inspired or something, then I can show the inconsistencies. But I know going in that that's not the way we should be looking at this. But I have to you have to kind of get down in the mud in order to bring that person back up out of the mud, maybe, is a way to think about that. And it's frustrating because I think Chris is absolutely right that there's so much more. If we're not talking about, was there a global flood? Right? Once we can get past that, then you can really, go pick up Ron Hendel's new commentary on Genesis, on the primeval history, and read
how
about
I
all the
wish.
polemics. Yeah, right. Like it's going to be great. But if you're stuck in that, and you're trying to like dig down into archaeological or geological levels and look for flood levels and try to match them up, it's like, oh my God, what are we doing? So I think that's part of the frustration that we feel in this question.
Yeah, imagine going up to somebody and going, why am I supposed to read Watchmen? It didn't literally happen like this. That's not the way that the United States history went. And you would just kind of look at them and go, that is nowhere near the point.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the way that people approach a lot of the biblical text, unfortunately, because it's foisted upon them that way, which sucks. But people feel like they can't get past, but it didn't happen this way. Okay, so now you can actually read it and get things out of it rather than being shackled to, is this true or not? Did this happen or not? Like, that's not how
nobody reads the Epic of Gilgamesh and lays awake at night saying, oh my gosh, he didn't really outrun the sun through the tunnel. Like, I can't get any meaning out of it.
All right, let me push this along a little bit. All right, Milwaukee Atheist for $5. You're on way too early. You needed to wait till later so Tomer could watch. Tomer never sleeps, so not a problem.
Tomer watches from the land of Israel.
Yeah, he's in Israel.
So.
Jesus Tales for $5 on continuity. Doesn't Merneptah's mention of Israel occur 100 years prior to any archaeological distinction that is tied to Israelite culture? Keep this one under 60 seconds and go.
Oh my God.
I'll start the timer when you start talking.
Okay, and go. Short answer, yes with an if. Long answer, no with a but. If I can draw from a classic Simpsons episode. But I'll tell you this much. I think when we talk about Israelite culture, early Israelite culture, it has a lot in common with Canaanite culture of the time. And it doesn't mean that it is Canaanite culture. There's a cultural conversation going on. And some of the things that we find in the Merneptah inscription, we find those same ideas in Exodus chapter 15, the Song of the Sea, which most scholars, at least I still think, consider an extremely ancient, if not the most ancient text, or the most ancient source in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, I date it to the 12th century BCE. So we're really talking about less than a century. We're talking about maybe 50 years or so. I'm done.
Nice.
Okay.
Very nice.
5 seconds to spare. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay. Ermgard for 5. Shawshank talks about sacking many cities, but doesn't identify Israel. Could this be the end of the Canaanite city-state system / clear the way for Omri?
Well, I'm curious to know what you guys think about that. I haven't really thought about that all that much.
No, I haven't either.
It's a good
What
question.
is it? It's like 980, 950, somewhere in that range. Isn't that when the
Shawshank, wasn't it a little bit later?
Yeah, I mean it's not my period.
I think I'd have to look it up.
So we're gonna bat this one, I think.
Okay.
As Josh would say, that's outside my area of expertise.
Right, that's my thing. It's my jam.
There you go. All right. Christopher Cotton for 10. Great conversation.
I'll take this one.
Thank you.
I'll take this one. Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. Good stuff. Jason Rollins for 5. How does Mark differentiate between a story that is a, quote, memory remembered and intentional literature?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it often depends on... I'm sorry?
I said 2 minutes, 3, or you want me to let you just like...
No, I can probably do it in less than 2.
Okay.
This is either a half an hour conversation or a minute and a half. There's no space in between. So I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of text that you're looking at. So if you're looking at a text like Judges chapter 5, the Song of Deborah, that remembers a lot of stuff, but it's also intentional literature. Intentional literature always embeds memory. There are presuppositions that people don't even know that they have, that we as historians and readers of the text can say, what does this presupposition remember about the past? So that's different than like a text that consciously knows that it's remembering something and is trying to repackage it in a different way. And we have lots of those texts as well. And those kind of jump out at us, like the description of Moses's name in Exodus chapter 2, where she called him Moses because she drew him from the water. I mean, that's a Hebrew attempt to make sense of a name with an Egyptian etymology, and it actually doesn't work. So there's a little bit of sleight of hand going on there, and that's very intentional too. So they're not separate things. I think they interplay with each other.
Well done. You still have like a minute to go.
Yeah. I do.
Like a pro.
I could tell you a joke.
All right. Captain Dadpool just got one in here for $5. If you were each made into an action figure, which accessory would you come with? Go. Kipp.
An accessory? Wow, probably. Is a toque part of my apparel, or is that an accessory?
Can you translate that into American?
Into American?
For some other viewers.
The unwashed masses call those wool hats, I think. Isn't that what y'all call them?
Beanies, toboggans.
You live in the US, Mark. Is that what they call them?
I don't know, because I don't talk to people about all that kind of stuff. I don't really wear a hat anyway. If I did wear a toque and somebody would say, "What is it?" I wouldn't come up with some kind of American version. I'd just say it's a toque. And then they would know what a toque is.
There you go.
Cool. What's your accessory then for your action figure, Mark?
Oh, that's easy. Hold on a second. It's right here.
He already has one.
It's this.
Yeah.
It's my
there you
guitar.
go. There you
one
go.
of my electric guitars. I designed this, and it plays beautifully, and it has a really wonderful, very traditional sort of classic tone. The pickups are completely noiseless. But they're true single coil pickups, and so they sounds just like a Fender Stratocaster. I designed the neck to have a little bit extra wood, so I had to make the neck cavity a little bit deeper, and that gives a much better stability and tone. And there's metal rods that run underneath the fretboard, so that the neck is very, very stiff and it sustains better. So I mean, this thing is this would definitely be my accessory. I have another couple guitars upstairs, but this is my number one.
So not just any guitar,
Nice.
that guitar.
That
guitar.
specific one. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the one.
Just in miniature. All right, Josh, what about you?
Josh.
What's your accessory?
It's either going to be the sword from Final Fantasy VII that Cloud carries, the one that's like insanely big and he can still manage, or this bow tie. Like, I don't know. I'd let people decide.
That one.
See, I was going to say a builder's cubit, but then I was like, no, I want the Doomslayer sword. If you're going to go like anime, I want the Doomslayer sword for sure. That's my builder's cubit. All right.
Awesome. Thanks, Captain Dadpool.
Want to get back to the stream?
Yeah, let's do that.
Sure.
Kenneth Kitchen, Old Testament scholar, says, duh, because that's not what Joshua says. It says 3 sites were burned: Jericho, Ai, Hazor. The rest were supposed to be used by the Israelites. They're supposed to just sort of come in, kick out the evil inhabitants, and take over. But we shouldn't expect to see a major difference.
Well, this depends very much on how Michael, and by extension, Canaan, are defining mass destruction. Because as I read the text, this is just wrong. Yes, Jericho, Ai, and Hazor are the only cities mentioned in the text specifically as having been burned. That's in Joshua 6:24, 8:28, 11, 11, and 13. There were actually either 7 or 8 cities in which the Israelites were commanded to destroy everything. That is, they were to kill everything and everyone alive, indiscriminate killing, and render everything else of value either useless or unto Yahweh's sanctuary.
Okay, so even if his interpretation is right, which I would challenge based on John Walton's research, even if he was right, that doesn't mean they're going to leave behind evidence of corpses for generations upon generations.
If they're going to take over a town, now some of these towns were not taken over after they were Haram, and they're specifically not taken over because they are Harammed. Like Jericho, there's a long fallow period after its late bronze destruction until the Iron Age. Hazor is not reoccupied. Hormah is not reoccupied. Ai is not reoccupied. So there are some of these Haram towns that once they are Harammed and burned, they remain unoccupied. And that's just part of the Haram in its most extreme form. Now, harems can vary. Not every harem is the same. So there's degrees of harem. Like, for example, Hebron is placed under the harem, but it's not destroyed. It's occupied. It's not a one sort of definition fits all situation.
All right. I think so. I threw that in there because I think this this question about Haram warfare, to my mind at least, is an interesting one to ask with regards to the social location of these texts, where they come from, and who they're addressing, and why. So I mean, on a couple of fronts, when reading a text like the Book of Joshua, what are some questions as historians that we should be asking, and also, as far as you understand it, what is Haram warfare and its function, specific to Joshua and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible? If maybe we can start there.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that the Book of Joshua is a book that details what amounts to genocide, and we can't get around that. Just because a text is holy within a religious tradition doesn't mean it's all unicorns and rainbows. It's got nasty stuff in it, and it doesn't mean that it's okay. Sometimes we have these texts in a religious tradition that compel us to say, what should I, as a person who's part of this religious community, how should I feel about this troubling text? And what is it trying to teach me about making decisions about what is right and what is wrong? I have some colleagues who really struggle with this because they're also very active in the church, and they're superb historians, but they struggle with these texts as scripture. And for them, they're acutely aware of the fact that these are terrifying texts, and these texts speak to the propensity for darkness, and we can't just brush that aside. So I think we always have to enter the text, especially a text dealing with warfare and Haram warfare, from that perspective. Haram is an extreme ideology. It's an ideology that sets aside. I mean, that's what the word Haram really means, sort of set aside, for the divine, something that is earthly, which means that it's no longer common, it's no longer accessible, it's no longer something that you should be able to interact with. It has to be separate, it has to be isolated, it has to be cut off. And that oftentimes takes place with the most violent means necessary. What's really interesting is something that Dr. Falk mentioned, which is that there seem to be different degrees of Haram. And I think that this is actually a really important point, because there's a bigger lesson to be learned from that. If there are different degrees of Haram, that means that there's variation in the meaning of a text, and that we have to think about the context for the text and what the word means in its literary context and what it might mean in its social context. You bring up the question of who are these texts written for? I was once of the belief, when I was an undergraduate student in the first couple of years of my graduate program, because I had teachers that suggested this, that these texts were written down to be used as teaching text for the broader public or the broader population in ancient Israel. And very few scholars really think that now. Most people in ancient Israel were not literate. They valued texts, but that doesn't mean they interacted with them. They saw texts as sources of power, but those sources of power were usually sort of scurried away in temple workshops and the libraries of elite scribes, and they were used as prestige literature. They were used as literature to reinforce the power of the people who are already in power. So these texts become the basis for what those powerful people then go out and tell the public, but it doesn't mean that they're reading the text to the public. So really, the texts are for them. The texts are for people who are already in power. These texts are meditations on power. These texts are meditations on the abuse of power. These texts are meditations on the capabilities and the limitations of powerful people, and the boundaries that you might have to impose upon offices that might work in one setting but might not work in another. I mean, in many ways, these are kind of works of political philosophy for people who are, in the higher ranks of society, who have access to politics and who have access to, everybody has access to politics, but have access to decision-making power within their political communities. And I think that that's an important thing to bear in mind too.
Yeah. I'm reminded, I read relatively recently, an excellent book by Tracy Lemos, where she connects this idea of Haram to land shortages as a way of effectively polemicizing against or even disenfranchising people almost in a land grab. It was and again, speaking from a position of people of power, to those underprivileged.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Josh, you got anything?
Oh no, I mean, no, I mean we can move to the last clip. I think that there was something that he said that sort of stuck out to me. Something that folks said, and I can't remember it now. In his initial response, but yeah, I mean, I think Haram. I mean, obviously Sihon and Og, right? You know, they in Transjordan, you know, the land according to the text was occupied then, right? You know, the people took it. So, and I think we see this. You know, I've got a spreadsheet that I put together on all the uses of Haram in the Hebrew Bible and went through and categorized them all because that's the nerd that I am. And I mean, there is some fluidity, right, in the way that it's applied, and sometimes it has this sort of general meaning of to fight or to beat, you know, in some of the texts of the Hebrew Bible, and other times it's very specific. And yeah, so I mean, I think allowing for that sort of fluidity is good, but I wish I could remember. I was hoping by saying all of that I would remember what it is that I disagreed with. He said, but I didn't. MS is a bitch. Sorry. No, we can go on to the last clip. Sorry.
Okay. All right.
The whole Haram thing seems to be much more exceptional than the rule. Yeah. It's not the rule. It's the exception. You know, he talks about this happening to 7 or 8 cities. Well, considering how many towns there are in Canaan, that's the exception. That's not the rule. And besides, the whole point of the conquest is to move in. It's not to burn everything and destroy everything. It's to move into people's cities, move into their homes, eat from their vineyards, eat off their dishes. So you're going to clean up the place after.
And stop the child sacrifice, according to Deuteronomy.
Stop the child sacrifice. Well, the fact is, too, that most of the Haram, almost every...
That was the thing that I remembered. Like,
right.
I didn't understand the point. And I think we're going to talk about this in another episode with rationality rules in more detail, so I won't talk about it much here. But I didn't quite understand the objection to what you were saying, like bringing up the bodies, and I didn't think that the point that you were making had anything to do with the number of cities and I thought the point was to make a comparison of the archaeological record from what we know. I thought that's what it was.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I don't remember.
It was kind of odd.
But the bodies thing threw me completely. Like, are we going to expect to see the bodies in the archaeological record? Like, what? Why are we bringing that up? I don't understand.
What was interesting to me about the clip that you just played was the concluding sentiment that Haram was used to put an end to child sacrifice.
That's something,
I mean, I suppose you could make that argument, but I don't know how much evidence you'll find in the text for that, that child sacrifice necessarily stopped, or that that's the purpose that it was used for. I mean, all I can think of is the stuff in the book of Jeremiah, which dates from around 600 or so. So many centuries after, a period of integration into the land. And yeah, it's still happening. And, and the very fact that Jeremiah has God say, I never wanted child sacrifice, it was never on my mind, lets you know that there are people doing it still in Jeremiah's day. So I don't know if Haram, it was in its totalizing effect, had child sacrifice on the list of things that you have to check off as things that you're getting rid of. Because you did get rid of it, and it seemed pretty normative in the prophetic literature of a much later time.
Yeah, you're being too nice. You could have just said he made it up. Because that's exactly what happened here. Like, I think they used Haram to get rid of child sacrifice. No, the source is he made it up. So.
Okay.
That's me, though. I'm petty, and I'm also not a scholar, so I don't have to be polite when I disagree with scholars who are just making shit up.
If there is nothing else that is true here, Mark, it is that you are like the epitome of politeness. This is I enjoy it. I
don't know.
enjoy
You
it.
and
Some guy
Kip
cut me off
both.
in traffic
Very
today, and I
Canadian.
wasn't very polite to him. I mean, I didn't give him the finger or anything. I just kind of gave him the stink eye. But you know, that's about as bad as it gets for me. You know, how dare you cut me off? But have a nice day.
Yeah.
You ready for the
Road
next
rage in Canada is something else. So
Yeah.
road rage in Canada? You ready for the next clip?
It's a stink eye.
Yes, no?
Yes.
Clip?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's watch the next clip.
Well, the fact is, too, that most of the harem, almost every instance of the harem, is not directed against an indigenous person. There's only one instance that I was able to find that connected harem to Canaanites, and that was with Arad. And that's because Arad attacks Israel while they're wandering in the Sinai. But with the exception of Arad, everything else was directed either against the Amorites or the Amalekites. Both of these are not native peoples to Israel. Amorites, they're from northern Mesopotamia. Amalekites, they're one of the sea peoples. They're the Amaluka.
Yeah. So the Amaluka. So I mean, I think on so one of the things that struck me in that clip is making this distinction between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples within the conquest narratives. And I mean, is there any kind of indication from like does the text understand these groups that way, even setting aside the historical question of all of this?
I don't think so. I have to really part ways on this because I mean, one of the things that Dr. Falk said is that like these people are not indigenous to Israel, but it wasn't called Israel then; it was just Canaan. You know, if he means the land of Israel as we understand it in in later Judaism or what is now the modern state of Israel, I mean, these are different questions. But in antiquity, I mean, especially in the 12th century and or the late 13th century and down to even the 10th century, the boundaries are shifting all the time, and groups are moving in and out, and they're moving in and out in a region that is not too vast. So I don't think that saying that they're not indigenous, I don't think it holds up real well, because if you're looking at the region, they're a part of that region and they were there for a long time. If you're looking at specific geopolitical boundaries, they don't exist quite yet. We can't really speak about geopolitical boundaries like an actual line that we could draw on a map until the reign of David or later. And we're talking about a period long before that. So I think that if you're talking about groups like the Amalekites, and you're saying that they're not indigenous to the region, but they are. And this brings me to the second point. We talked about this a little bit before. So Dr. Falk associates the Amalekites with the Sea People and likens them to a group that I'm not familiar with. I'm not going to dismiss that out of hand as wrong, because I just don't know enough about this group that he's referring to. But most of the scholarship, I'd say almost all of the scholarship that I've encountered on the Amalekites, sees them as an Eastern people, a semi-nomadic Eastern people, West Arabia up into the Negev region, not a Western people that are coming from the Aegean and settling in the coast, and then penetrating into the land. Most of the traditions that we have in the Hebrew Bible, the really old traditions that refer to the Amalekites, seem to suggest that they are in fact fixtures of the region, and that there's actually strong connections, like even kinship connections with some of the tribes of Israel. So I think it is, again, Judges chapter 5, that tells us that Ephraim has its roots in Amalek. So one of the Israelite tribes, one of the major Israelite tribes, has some kind of kinship connection with Amalek. We also find references to Amalek in other places. The specific passages are I'm having a hard time remembering exactly what they are, but I remember the locution. And the locution is that the Amalekites are associated with the B'nai Kedem, the children of the East. So I think, I think you could make a case that they are to be associated with the sea people, but you have to do more than just listen to a similarity in the way a word sounds and say that that's exactly who these people are. I think you have to make a stronger philological argument than that if you're going to take on all this other information that we have that situates them in the southeast and not among the sea people that are coming in from the west and into the coast.
This is one of the things that I think stands out to me. The more that I listen, the more it frustrates me, is that somebody like Dr. Falk, who is well credentialed, right?
Yeah.
PhD from Liverpool, like I think when you make these sort of definitive statements, X is the case, it frustrates me. Maybe it shouldn't as much as it does, but it does, because then I have to try to contend with it, and I have to try to ascertain, okay, is there some sort of validity to that? Because I've never heard that before. So you end up emailing people that specialize in the field in that particular time frame with the sea peoples, and you say, do you know of anything like this? And they say, nope, never heard of it. And then you still lie awake at night thinking maybe there was a 2024 publication that came out that I don't know about, right? And it's vexing. It's interesting, that article that I sent you guys, that new Festschrift, Steiner, had a discussion on the etymology of the Amalekites, and of course had nothing to do with the Leuchter. But I think that's where I would hope for. I hope that I exercise the type of caution, Mark, that you've been talking about in this conversation to a greater than lesser degree in these discussions, particularly with things like this that are outside of my area of specialization, because I think we have a responsibility out here, particularly if we've got doctor before our name, that people, whether they should or not, tend to listen to us about things that we say, which is why my catchphrase is, this isn't my area of specialization, so I'm probably not going to say anything about it. But that's why. Also fear of my advisor hearing this somehow and then killing me. So, it's all there. But anyway, go ahead.
Who was your advisor? I'm just curious.
Paul Del Nero.
Oh, I don't know his record in terms of like violence and taking revenge for misrepresentation or something. So, but then again, he might have ties with the underworld that I don't know about. So who knows?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't need a record to fear him, right? I don't think this is the nature of the beast.
There you go. So Falk actually, he made another video just this last week where he attempted to clarify his historical model of the geopolitical situation in late Bronze Age Canaan and expanded specifically on this point about the Amalekite. Do you want to bring that up, Vish? And we'll just look at that. These are like the last two clips of the of what we have prepared for this evening. But
we then have a second wave of sea peoples that invaded the coastal plain of Canaan in the late 14th, early 13th century. They spread down the coastal plain and eventually moved into the Negev, where they integrated with the peoples of Arad, and into the Sinai, where they became nomadic groups similar to the Shasu. Let's talk about the Leuchter, because they got around almost as much as the Amorites did. They probably originated in the Anatolian region of Lycia, but they don't stay there. In the 1340s, they attempted to invade Alashia in El Amarna 38, but appear to have been repelled. They established a presence in the coastal plain in the early 13th century and reached Libya by the late 13th century. So the Leuchter expanded earlier, further, and faster than other tribes of sea people. In the biblical accounts, there's a group called the Amalekites, which etymologically means people of the Leuchi. Normally, when I present that view, I get objections. First, quote, they can't be Amalekites because the Leuchter are from Anatolia. Well, no kidding. Being a sea people is by definition being from Anatolia or the Greek archipelago. The second objection I get is that the Amalekites are there too early. See myth number 3. There were no sea peoples in Canaan prior to 1175 because the earliest record we have of the sea peoples are the invasions recorded by Ramses III. We have records of sea peoples tribes mentioned in the Amarna letters circa 1340 BC and in the Kadesh inscriptions circa 1283 BC. The idea that there were no sea peoples in Canaan prior to the 12th century was debunked long ago. And a third objection I get is that the Amalekites are simply Canaanites because they're found in the plain of Arad. Sea peoples moved all over the place, including into the Negev. Deal with it.
Oh, deal with it feels like maybe not the most convincing explanation here. It's interesting to think about his view of this group that came down from Anatolia into the coastal plain and then moved inland towards Arad relative. And I hadn't even really thought about this until you brought it up. But with the that important association, right? That the Song of Devorah makes with Ephraim and the Amalekites. I'd be very interested to hear how he works through something like that.
Well, I think one of the problems with Dr. Falk's approach here, and I have to plead ignorance on a lot of this stuff because he's talking about an area that I just don't research. And I'll take him at his word on some of these sources. I mean, I have no reason to doubt some of what he's talking about here, but I run into some problems precisely because of this text that you're talking about, Judges chapter 5. It's a very old text. It presupposes that there is some kind of kinship union between Ephraim and Amalek. Not just that they're neighbors, but that there's kinship going on there. Your roots are in Amalek. I mean, we find language like that with respect to kinship in the book of Amos from the mid-8th century BCE, or Amos's Oracles from the mid-8th century BCE. The book probably was put together a little bit later. This is a bit of a stumbling block because if you want to make the case that the biblical sources are historically accurate, then you have to account for the tableau that we encounter in Judges 5, where there's this kinship connection between the Amalekites and the Ephraimites at a very early point in time. I think we have another reference to that in Judges chapter 12. I'd have to go back, but I think it's there. So there's some old traditions preserved in the book of Judges which see Ephraim and Amalek is bound together on the level of kinship, and the way that tribes form is through kinship associations and intermarriage and economic codependency over time. So we're talking about a long-term relationship here between this old group of people called Ephraim that becomes central to the Israelite Tribal League and the Amalekites. If that's historically accurate, and we don't have reasons to I don't think we have a good reason to just throw that stuff out. I mean, I think that there's something there that we need to tease out a little bit more if we could ever figure out a way to do it. Then it causes problems for seeing the Amalekites as a non-indigenous group or a group that's not native to the region in general, as you're trying to reconstruct an era of the conquest. You can't reconcile the two, so you have to read them differently if you do want to reconcile them as pieces of data that are giving us very different stories. I have much more to say, but I'm curious to know what you all think about that, and then we can go on from there.
Josh?
I mean, certainly, like outside of my area. Again, my only thought in all of this is I wish that he would provide some citations.
Yeah.
But from what he just said, and I hadn't seen that clip until just now, it sounds like it's his idea. I could be wrong, but I mean, it does sound like it's his idea. And I mean, hey, awesome. Like if he thinks he's got a good case to make, man, write a paper, right? Like put it out there for people to respond to. But just saying,
Steiner Yeah, no, that article you sent us, Steiner just wrote a paper and said a lot of really interesting things about about how to read the Conquest story, or sorry, the Exodus story relative, in the time of Merneptah, and specifically with regards to the Amalekites. So yeah, I mean it's the way you do it, right?
And obviously,
go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, and of course, like Steiner's assessment of Egyptian etymology, like, my God, further from my field that could not be. So, yeah, like Mark, I'm take people's word for it or send it off. Like I sent it off to Maggie and said, "Can you please look at this because you're a New Kingdom expert." But yeah, I mean, that's much more I can't say.
I'd also want to draw attention to a really influential article that was published in 1993 by David Schlun, called "Caravans, Kenites, and Casus Belli," and it dealt with Judges chapter 5, and it reconstructs the social context for what that ancient poem is talking about. And one of the things that emerges from this article, and I think he makes an extremely compelling case, is that the Amalekites are part of a tribal league. And if they're part of a Midianite tribal league, then you have to start factoring what we know about Midian and the work that's been done on Midianite sociology and the traditions and the Kenite groups that get connected to Israel at a later point in time. You have to factor that into your discussion of, well, this group comes from the Sea People. Do we have, like, if you want to make the case, you could make the case if you can find other examples of Sea Peoples joining Eastern tribal leagues like the Midianite tribal league. And if you can make that case, then you have a point of comparison, and then you could make a stronger argument for it. And I'm not bashing this out of hand. I don't think it's a stupid argument at all, but it needs to be an argument, right? You have to walk us through the evidence for why this group of people that is primarily only mentioned in the Bible suddenly should be associated with this group that's well attested in the Amarna correspondence, etc. And I think that really would make a very fascinating paper, and that would be a really influential way to get people to start thinking a little bit differently about this stuff. Because even though I, as an academic, and you as academics, I think would agree with me, even though we busy ourselves with trying to challenge axiomatic readings of the text that have attended religious readings for a long time, there are scholarly axioms too, and those need to be busted sometimes as well. And we need to be willing to do some self-exploration, but we shouldn't give up on methodological rigor and sidestep that just because an axiom needs to be challenged. I mean, if you really want to challenge an axiom, play the rules of the game and go through the rigorous stages of, here's the evidence, here's the comparative stuff, here's the archaeological stuff, the philological stuff, here's the mnemohistorical stuff that we have in the biblical text. Where do these constellations lead us? How does this all tie together, and what are the implications here? Instead of saying, I see a connection and therefore I'm going to only focus on the parts of the evidence that reinforce the connection that I see, as opposed to looking a little bit more broadly and saying, well, is there something else there that I haven't thought about that might enrich the observation that I've made and maybe make it more tenable?
Just deal with it, Mark.
Yeah.
I'll do my best.
All right. So we got this in that same video, and we'll just watch this last clip and then answer some more questions, and we'll let you go. We really appreciate you taking the time out. Thank again, you, Mark. This has been just fantastic. So just a reminder
for me.
Oh, good. Well, maybe we'll convince you to come back and we can talk about people of the land and or
the Levites.
Duty. Or the Levites.
I thought we were also going to talk about the Nephilim. These are my favorite people
this is coming up. Yeah. So just before you start it, Vish,
there were no Nephilim.
Can you pause it for a sec? I just did want to set this up a little bit. In the same video, he speaks about so he's speaking about ethnic groups specifically from the Bible, and he says about the Gibeonites, in some places the Amorites assimilated local Canaanite populations forming their own hybrid ethnic groups, like the Jebusites, which were centered in Jerusalem, and the Gibeonites, centered around Gibeon, and the Perizzites, and in the Judean foothills. So then from there, he also goes on to talk about the Nephilim. So
okay.
And finally, there were the Nephilim. Now, let me be really explicit about this. There were no Nephilim in Canaan at the time of the Israelite conquest. They were all dead by the time of Joshua. This comes from this report from the bad spies in Numbers 13:33, which they said, oh, we see Nephilim. They made this up to justify their cowardice. There were no Nephilim in Canaan. This was basically bad spies trying to scare the people.
All right, I think that's it. So, Mark, who are the Nephilim?
Most scholars, myself included, but Ron Hendel and lots of other people have worked on this, look at the Nephilim as a kind of literary character that represents the forces of death in the underworld. The word Nephilim is plural for nafal, which means to fall or fallen one. So the Nephilim are fallen ones who have descended into the underworld. And there's a great passage in Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of heaven, right, the sons of Elohim, have the angels have descended, into the world of men and had sex with human women, and the episode ends with the phrase, and the Nephilim were in the land at that time. And what this, I think one way to read this, and maybe the best way to read this, at least in context, is that things have gotten so bad since the creation. Like you have the episode in the Garden of Eden, and you have Cain and his descendants, and humanity has become very violent, and there's transgression, and then finally we have this rupture between heaven and earth, and the boundaries between the angels above and humans below, that's been ruptured, and if all these ruptures are taking place, then of course the dead ones are in the land. Of course the dead are walking the earth. It's this idea, it's this represent the dead ones. And this is something that Ron Hendel wrote about in a paper in 1987 that was published in the Journal of Biblical Literature. And I think he's right. So I don't want to say that Falk's read on the spies episode is wrong, because it's a theological interpretation.
Right.
And I think that that's fair. That's okay. But I don't think we can take it as a historical notice, because we're dealing with a mythological trope. We're dealing with ideological literature that's using the language of symbolism to say something about the fear of death and the connection of the land as a space of chaos, the space of danger, the space where the chaos monsters are still roaming around. And I think that that's the best way to understand the role of the Nephilim. They're not an ethnic group. So when he said in his video clip that the Nephilim were already dead, he's completely right. But not for the reasons that I think he would think. And I may be wrong about this. I mean, again, I'm looking at this as symbolic literature that encapsulates a way that ancient people understood the world that they lived in, the way that some people still do believe that the world, the further away you get from the ordinary and the familiar, the closer you get to the forces of death and the forces of chaos and things like that. And I think that when the spies are talking about Nephilim in the land, what they're really doing is saying that this land is a chaotic land, and here we are, mere human beings. How can we defeat the forces of chaos? And the point of the story is they're forgetting that they have Yahweh, the God of Israel, behind them, and Yahweh can defeat the forces of chaos. So it's not that they're lying about the land so much. I mean, this is my sort of literary reading of the text, is that the author of the text is suggesting that people forget that death can be conquered by the patron God of the nation. And I think that, again, this is why reading these texts not as plain literary or plain literal representations of events, but as coded cultural discourses, tells us a lot more about what the authors are trying to get across, or what ideas the authors are transmitting that they've inherited that they want their audiences to be aware of.
Yeah, I think there's another. This is I would think this same holds right for another group that's mentioned in the book of Joshua, the Rephaim, as well, right? These are the shades, the spirits, wow. No, that's that, and I think that just helps to reinforce the setting and the purpose of a lot of these texts.
Let me give one other brief example that reinforces this. Right around the time that the Babylonian armies were just about to enter Jerusalem and destroy it, famous oracle in chapter 9 of the book of Jeremiah, and he says that death has come in through the window and has entered our house, right?
Yeah.
So he's not talking about a sickness. He's talking about a mythological force manifest in a historical reality. So he's seeing Babylon entering Jerusalem as a historical iteration of a mythological prototype. Okay, so he doesn't think that the Babylonians are cosmic beings. He thinks that they're normal human beings, but they represent a cosmic prototype, a cosmic force, a cosmic foe that on the conceptual level informs the way he understands the politics of his life and his world and his society. I think that the authors in the Bible that are using references to the Nephilim are doing the same kind of thing. Or for the Rephaim, the same thing as well.
Yeah.
They're using these mythological tropes to say something about forces that they thought were real in their world. Now, we might not think that they're real, or we might think that they're real. I met all kinds of people who believe in cosmic forces, demons and things like that. I mean, some people in my family actually believe that. I mean, who am I to say that they're wrong? But my point is that if we are looking at these texts as coded cultural discourses that are meant to convey something about how these people saw their world, that says a lot more about why they seem the way that they seem. And I think we don't have to necessarily be restricted to seeing them as, journalistic reports of things that actually happened or people that actually, lived and breathed. Oftentimes, these texts are talking about things that happened and people that lived and breathed. Yeah. But I think with things like the Nephilim, we're talking about a symbolic discourse on the forces of death and the dangers of chaos.
Yeah. I think that's probably a good place to end. We'll look at a couple more questions, but just before we do, I wanted to maybe just get your thoughts on one last thing. You had talked about the language of the book of Joshua as a way to locate it within the 8th, 7th century at the earliest. I wondered, are there other indicators in the text which help scholars to date or to find an historical or a social cultural setting for the book of Joshua?
Yeah, there are a couple things. I'll only mention two of them briefly. So one are place names. The second part of the book of Joshua is about apportioning the land to the various tribes. And some of the place names that are mentioned in these lists are places that, from an archaeological perspective, would not have existed in the 12th or 13th century BCE. They do exist in the 8th century and beyond. So this is one reason why many scholars think that the texts as we have them are shaped by an 8th to 7th to 6th century BCE group of scribes or succession of scribes. Another thing is the sociology of the text. The sociology of the text speaks to structured societies that would not have been in place, I think, in a settling group, but would have been in place by an 8th, 7th century BCE, because you have an economy that structures these societies over time. You have natural resources and economic resources and monarchic influence and taxation and boundary setting and things like that. There's all kinds of anthropological things that speak to the structuring of family and clan units that we see represented in the book of Joshua, that speak to a group of people that have been in the land for quite a while and are perhaps reflecting on memories of the past, but refracting it through their more recent experiences. So the story of chapter 7, where Achan and his family are identified, as the person who steals, you know, the loot from Jericho, and the casting of the lots to discover who the culprit is. Baruch Halpern wrote a really good article about this. This represents the sociological organization of the countryside from the 10th through the 8th century BCE.
Oh,
so
wow.
That's a plausible background for this narrative and for the world that the authors and the audience of the narrative would have known. But that sociological background wouldn't have been in place for a group of people that are sort of, you know, just coming out of 40 years of wandering in the desert or something like that. So again, these are things that tell us, like, we're dealing with some historical details here, but the historical details don't necessarily lead us to the conclusions that the surface level of the text wants us to understand.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
We have a few more super chats and questions.
Super chats.
Bish.
All right, let's do this. Milwaukee Atheist for $2 that kept watching my video. If not, I'll be sad.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lawrence. I have watched about 37% of your video. I promise I'll get around to finishing it. But dude, it's like an hour and a half. It's super long,
Ooh,
right?
it's a documentary.
So,
all right, Jamie for $9.99. Thank you. It's been deliciously educational and entertaining.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. This isn't a joke about oxes and stuff from earlier in the chat. It probably would have been better if I'd spotlighted this during the conversation, but silly me.
Oh, wow. All
Anyway.
right. Is that it?
All right.
Oh, we got one more.
No. Jesus Tales for $5. Was Joshua written within with the time period the book was slotted into, in the canon, extra in there, in mind? If not, is there a better time period it is supposed to reflect?
I mean, Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Obviously, like, I think Finkelstein, from an archaeological perspective, makes arguments about, cities that are mentioned or toponyms, understanding of the region, and so it fits I think a 7th century is what he was arguing. I can't remember off the top of my head, but
but he's not the only person who's argued that, like, a 7th, 6th century background is reflected in some of the sociological and linguistic or philological features of the text. I think we also have to think about what a text like this says to a people that have been living under the thumb of foreign imperialism for, a century and a half. It's culturally humiliating to live under the thumb of a powerful foreign empire. If I can draw from my own experience, if you ask a Canadian what makes them Canadian, almost immediately their first thing is, well, first of all, I'm not an American. And part of the reason why that's such a go-to is because there's 10 times more people in the United States. It has a much bigger gross national product. Its cultural output is much more well entrenched. Now, I like Canadian rock music a lot, but we also have something called CanCon. And that's because if we didn't have the Canadian content rule, then the radio stations would be playing almost exclusively American rock music, right? So when you're a smaller culture living under or next to a bigger culture, you already have a sort of inferiority complex. How much more so is that the case when that bigger culture, which is much older than you, like Assyria or like Babylon, is militaristically and economically dominating you, and taking your land and corrupting your priesthoods and taking your king captive and things like that. So I think seeing the Joshua narrative as a sort of idealized way to cling to a glorious past when we were all warriors and we kicked ass and took names. I mean, that's one way of understanding why Joshua looks the way that it looks. The second thing, though, that's important to bear in mind is that if you want people to buy a story, it has to be a story that they're familiar with and that they're willing to accept its terms. So even if Joshua, as we currently have it, is a later work of literature and informed by later sociopolitical realities, it's still playing upon commonly held oral traditions that must have been very familiar to people. I use the example of Elf, the Will Ferrell movie. Elf is not the first time somebody had ever heard of Santa Claus. Right? Elf only works as a movie if there's a long-standing tradition of Santa Claus mythology that everybody knows. So the book of Joshua only works as a story, even if it's an idealized story, if there's already existing traditions about Joshua that people already know. I think that that's what we're looking at, this dynamic between oral and written tradition and how they're constantly working with each other.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think I mean I think there's some reflection of the conquest stories and what we read in the book of Joshua in places like in Ezra and Nehemiah. They're definitely teasing out some of what's already there. Are you I'm not familiar with any others, but are there other places internally within the biblical text where they seem to be drawing from or reflecting back on these stories in Joshua?
A little bit. I think I agree with people who see a connection between Joshua and King Josiah and the accounts of King Josiah. There are a lot of scholars who would make the argument that when in Joshua, I think it's chapter 8, when he reads the Torah after a military victory, that is very similar to King Josiah reading the Torah or having a Torah reading ceremony in his reign. And many scholars have concluded that the Joshua story is meant to sort of reinforce, almost as propaganda, the Josiah episode. But you could make the case that there was a long-standing tradition of Joshua being a teacher, maybe not of like the Deuteronomic Torah, but of some kind of, some kind of revelatory tradition. And the literary connection is a little bit more complicated than that. I don't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other, but that's what some of the discussion is, that sees a relationship between the Book of Kings and the Book of Joshua. And I think that there's something there, and I think it's worth exploring.
Nice. Awesome. Thanks. Okay, I think we got 2 or 3 more here, and then we'll
two or
shut
three
it down.
more. Yep. Well, okay, these are 2. Dear Egyptologists, stay out of biblical studies. Or at least just couch your language so that people don't think that you're an expert when you're not. It's probably more reasonable. All right, and Batad for 5. I know Dr. Kipp and Josh, but not Mark. He seems cool, though. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
I agree, he's cool.
He's got a guitar.
I'm trying to finish an album, but instead of laying down vocals tonight, here I am. So thank you, because I'm a really terrible singer and I hate singing. This is much more fun.
Well, we really appreciate your sacrifice to join us this fine evening, and it's getting late for you guys. So I think well, yeah. I think we should probably wrap it up. Any final thoughts, Josh?
No, just Mark, thank you so much. I've been in 2 streams with you now, and both times I feel stretched, and it's a really nice feeling. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I feel like I learned a lot tonight too.
Definitely.
So did I.
My
really
brain sponge is
awesome.
full. We got a free master class, so.
Well, that's what comes out when we have these earnest conversations. We all walk away from them with something that we can really think about for a long time.
Absolutely. Sweet. All right. Well,
Mark, is there a place where people can pre-order your book?
It's coming out through Oxford University Press. It's called, I'll tell you the title. It's a typical academic book with an unsexy title. The way it works is you have sexy title, unsexy subtitle. So the sexy title is An Empire Far and Wide, which is how the Persian lot. And then the subtitle is The Achaemenid Dynastic Myth and Jewish Scribes in the Late Persian Period. And I'm really, really happy with how the book turned out. And studying the Persian period is relatively recent for me because I've mostly done monarchic era stuff. But I'm moving forward. I'm sticking with the Persian period and the Hellenistic period because there's just oodles of delicious stuff going on there, and there's so much good scholarship that's really exciting to read. So you could probably eventually you'll find that the book up on Oxford University Press's website. I'm on Twitter. I'm happy to talk to people on Twitter. It's just @markleuchter.com. No, just at Mark Leuchter. Sorry. And drop me a line and say hi, and let me know if you have further things you want to talk about from our conversation tonight. This was so much fun for me. I really, really, really had a good time.
Awesome. Well, I really hope that we can we can coax you back at some point in the near future. That'd be fantastic. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in and for watching. I hope everyone learned as much as we did. And with that, I'm gonna say good night.